This is lecture number 15 for Friday, May 15th, for the French Revolution at Northland College. Today I'm going to finish off the Terror. And so I talked before about the sort of first surge of terror in late 1793, because you had the Vendée Revolt and the Chouans, which was a conservative peasant revolt in the west of France, and then you had the Federalist Revolt in Lyon, Marseille, Bordeaux, and a couple of other cities. And these two things together had triggered a sort of violent reaction by the convention against all of this opposition. And they had formed revolutionary armies and had marched down with representatives on mission in charge of these armies. And they had retaken all the cities in the Federalist Revolt. They had crushed the Vendée Rebellion. And in the process, they had carried out lots of mass executions. In Lyon, they burned down most of the city and carried out the mitraillades by lining people up and blasting them with cannons. In Nantes, they did the noyades. They had mass, guillotinings in Toulon and elsewhere. And so the group of representatives on mission who had led this, people like Carrier and Collot d'Herbois and Fouché, came to be known as the terrorists because they were spreading terror everywhere. But then in early 1794, the Federalist Revolt had basically been put down, the Vendée Revolt had been put down, and the convention could sort of focus again on fighting the war against everybody else in Europe. And the one other point from the last lecture was that that a number of the terrorists, especially Fouché, tried to push this idea of de-Christianization, that they were going to actively destroy Christianity as a force because they thought it was counter-revolutionary. And this struck a lot of people in the convention as being, a bridge too far. This was too much. They weren't ready to go after Catholicism. And as a result, you began to see a faction forming in the convention around Danton. Danton was had been part of the previous governments and had been a leader at the time the monarchy was toppled. He's in the Constitutional Convention. He had come up through the Cordelier Club. Along with him, Desmoulins. Desmoulins had been also there from the beginning of the Revolution. He was one of the prime instigators of the October Days. He was also a Cordelier Club member. And so Danton, Desmoulins began to really push, and a number of others like Fabre d'Eglantine, began to push back on the terrorists and began to say, this terror stuff is out of control, we need to stop this. And they began publishing a newspaper called Le Vieux Cordelier, which means the old Cordelier, and they called to their followers to say, remember back when the Cordelier Club was founded, it was about justice and et cetera, it wasn't just about blood, so let's go back to that older idea, okay? And so they came to be called the Indulgents because they really didn't want to execute more people. And they began to say these executions are out of control, de-Christianization is out of control, we're going too far, we're spinning out of control, we need to back off. And I want to point out that at this time, Danton and Desmoulins were the most outspoken, but they were joined by Robespierre. Robespierre also was really nervous about the way the revolution was going, and I'll talk much more about him later. But the Danton and Desmoulins really were not fully supporting the Cordelier Club. The Cordelier Club had a lot of members who were closely associated with the terrorists. There are a number of terrorists in the Cordelier Club. Guys named Vincent and Ronsin were both members of the Cordelier Club. And a lot of members of the Cordelier Club had connections to the sections, to the sans-culottes, to the sort of people in the streets, the lower classes. And in particular, Hébert, who I talked about before, was a newspaper publisher and one of the enragés. He was a supporter of the terror, and he was also connected to the Cordelier Club. Some other members who were terrorists and were in the Cordelier Club, Ronsin and Vincent. So Robespierre initially aligns with Danton and Desmoulins, and in fact, when some people in the Cordelier Club stood up and said, we don't like Danton's idea of being indulgent, we need more blood. Robespierre actually gave a speech at the Jacobin Club, because Robespierre is in the Jacobin Club, saying, no, Danton is right, we're going too far. I'll just put up a couple of other names of terrorists here. Ones that would be important later. Collot d'Herbois is also in the Cordelier Club. So it's the Cordelier Club becomes this scene of sort of this split, as some people are really critical of the massacres and the terror, and some people are very supportive of it. And this is playing out in the Cordelier Club, but it's also playing out in the convention as people are arguing in the convention. Well, in the middle of this, one of Danton's closest associates, a guy named Fabre d'Eglantine, gets accused of corruption. It comes out that he was involved in a scandal involving the East India Company and stock trades and secret deals, etc. And it sounded like bribery. And so suddenly Fabre d'Eglantine looks bad. And Danton is the only one who really defends his friend Fabre d'Eglantine. But Danton, Desmoulins, and Robespierre's, their attacks on the terrorists started to make the terrorists form into a block. They started to realize that they were in serious jeopardy here, because if the convention decided that they had done something illegal or wrong, they could be arrested and maybe executed. So they suddenly realized that they were very vulnerable and that the indulgence might actually get them killed. And so you see the terrorists start to really hang together. Ronsin was one of the commanders of the Revolutionary Army under Fouché and Collot d'Herbois, and in putting down Lyon, he was the one who had ordered the mitraillades. Carrier is also involved here. He was the one who did the noyades in Nantes. So Robespierre then agrees. Robespierre is now on the Committee of Public Safety, and the Committee of Public Safety is sort of the center of the government at this point. It's the executive committee of the government. So Robespierre sets up several special commissions, and these special commissions are supposed to investigate all of the executions that representatives on mission have done and decide if they were right or wrong. And so they're starting to do an investigation of the terrorists to see what's happening. And in response, Collot d'Herbois and another guy named Biot, who was a terrorist, pushed through a vote in the Committee of Public Safety to abolish the special committee. So they're fighting it out in the Committee of Public Safety also. And then, in response to that, Desmoulins began to argue that Hébert and several others were actually British agents, that France was at war with Britain, and they argued they were actually taking money from Britain, and they were terrorists because Britain had asked them to make the revolution become so bloody that it discredited the revolution and made everyone turn against it. So Desmoulins began to accuse Hébert and the other terrorists of being in the pay of Britain, which is really certainly would be a death sentence if that got proven, and if people started believing that. So the things are getting really nasty. But when the news comes out about Fabre d'Eglantine and the corruption, this causes a break, because Robespierre is totally not going to be on board with corruption. Now, Danton himself there's a lot of evidence that he took bribes at various points, and there was a lot of stories about Danton's corruption. And Danton was known to be this sort of big drinking, loved big feasts and spending money like crazy, and he loved to have big parties, and he was sort of a larger-than-life figure. He was a brilliant orator. He was absolutely spellbinding as an orator. He could captivate a crowd, which is why he had become a leader in the revolution, but everyone sort of knew he was just a little bit seedy and a little bit corrupt. So when Fabre d'Eglantine gets accused of this scandal with the East India Company, everyone's like, oh yeah, well, Danton, and what do you expect? He hangs out with Danton. These guys are all corrupt. So when that happens, Robespierre really has to break with them. And Robespierre is an interesting case because he was a very interesting guy. Robespierre was, above all, a man of clear and rigid principles. He thought principles were the only thing that mattered in life. And so he thought that you absolutely, he had virtually no people skills whatsoever. When he gave speeches, he was sort of wooden, and he spoke in a high voice, and he tried to prove it through logic rather than moving anybody. So he and Danton were kind of opposites. Danton was totally a people person. He was warm. He was effusive. He was enthusiastic. He was energetic. He got people on board with his emotion. He drew them into him. Robespierre was cold and rigid and rational and pushed people away. Right? And Robespierre was very much an apostle of Rousseau. He argued that Rousseau was Robespierre's principles were totally guided by Rousseau, and in particular the social contract. And he spoke quite a bit about virtue, and in particular Republican virtue. And you remember that in the social contract, Rousseau said that a democracy can only work if all of the citizens in the democracy have what he called virtue. And virtue in this case means putting what's good for the group ahead of what's strictly good for the individual. And the assumption is if the group prospers, the individual will prosper also. But if each individual thinks only of themselves and not of the group's going to fall apart. And so Rousseau argued that a democracy can only function if everybody absolutely puts the good of the group above their own personal well-being or their own personal wealth and etc. And Republican virtue was the absolute foundation of a republic. And so Robespierre takes this idea, and he absolutely embraced this idea of Republican virtue. But for him, it gets kind of mixed up with this idea of also a sort of ascetic vision of life, rejecting anything fun or pleasurable. And so Robespierre, when he lived in Paris, he originally from Arras, which is a city north of Paris. So when he lived in Paris, he just stayed at this little apartment of an artisan family, a working class family. He just rented a bed in like the corner of their living room. And he had no possessions really. He wore kind of old-fashioned clothing. He clearly didn't care about fashion. And he was very rigid, and he believed absolutely no vice, no drinking, no gambling, he thought that you had to really just reject all of that in order to live by your principles. And he was kind of an absolutist. He really believed that if you're going to have principles, you do it all the way or not at all. Right? So when he hears about Danton and Fabre-d'Églantine, or in particular when the accusations of Fabre-d'Églantine come out, Robespierre cannot ignore it. He's like, I cannot ally myself with corrupt people who are taking bribes, and there's a movie called Danton starring Gérard Depardieu, and there's a great scene in the movie where Danton realizes that he's losing Robespierre, that Robespierre is moving away from him because of the corruption, and so Danton decides he's gonna try to sort of seduce Robespierre again, not sexually, but to sort of get him back on board using all of his charisma. And so he wants to have a meeting with Robespierre, and so Robespierre agrees to have a meeting, and Danton in the movie, this is just the movie, brings Robespierre to this apartment, and he's got all these fancy dishes of food laid out, and he's got wine everywhere, and Robespierre just like looks at the food, I don't want any of it, looks at the wine, I don't drink, and so Danton tries to sort of convince him, but the more Danton talks about it, the more you can see Robespierre going, I don't agree with any of this, right? So Robespierre is an interesting figure, and he had enormous clout in the revolution precisely because he was so obviously not in it for himself, and he was so obviously didn't have any vices, right? This guy who didn't drink, he didn't eat to excess, he didn't wear nice clothes, he didn't live in a nice house, he clearly wasn't interested in money, he didn't seem to be interested in power, he seemed to be totally interested in Republican virtue and rigid principles. And so a lot of people, even if they didn't like him, they totally respected him and listened to him because he was so obviously driven by principle more than anything else. Well, Robespierre, as the terror went on in 1793, and the reports start coming back about the mitraillades and the noyades, etc., Robespierre is really kind of troubled by it because he really feels like the revolution is spinning out of control. And he's desperately, he wants the revolution to be guided by virtue, not by passion or anger, or certainly not by bloodthirstiness. But as he looks around, as he deals in the convention and in the Committee of Public Safety, he's got all these terrorists around him who are doing all the stuff he disapproves of, and then he's got other people like Danton and Fabre-d'Églantine who seem to be corrupt, and he starts to become more and more concerned that the leaders of the revolution are really all corrupted somehow. They're either carried away by bloodthirsty passion, or they're carried away by corruption and greed, and he really starts to feel like there's nobody in the revolution he can trust. And so he really starts to formulate this idea that the revolution needs to be cleansed of all of the sins it's done and put back on course, right? And so Robespierre realizes that he's got to do, if he really wants to get the revolution back on course the way he understands it, he has to take out two groups in particular. One is he's got to take out the terrorists, but the terrorists are closely allied with the sans-culottes, and so Robespierre realizes that he really has to do something to sort of rein in the sans-culottes, and he realizes the sans-culottes really listened to these guys, the enragés. Right now, they had arrested several enragés earlier in the revolution because they had threatened the convention. People like Jacques Roux and drawing a blank, Varlet. I think I said Hébert got arrested before. I was a mistake on my part. Hébert did not get arrested before. But now Robespierre starts to target people like Hébert and the people in the Cordelier Club who are really popular with the sans-culottes because they're so bloodthirsty. He starts to say, I've really got to do something about them. And then I've got to do something about all these corrupt people like Danton and Fabre-d'Églantine and Desmoulins and their crowd, because they're pulling the direction. Both groups are doing something horrible with the revolution. The terrorists are driving the revolution into bloodthirstiness, which will make it destroy itself, and the indulgents are driving it towards corruption, which will also destroy it, because both of them will get rid of republican virtue. And so Robespierre decides that he has to do something about all of it. The first thing he does is in January of 1794, he doesn't do it himself, but Fabre-d'Églantine gets arrested for corruption. So Fabre-d'Églantine is in jail, and the only person who really defends him after that is Danton. But beginning at that time, with the indulgence, Robespierre begins to first he starts to give a whole bunch of speeches at the convention talking about virtue, and his speeches, we have accounts of the speeches. They get more and more focused on virtue, and they're almost obsessive about virtue. And it's clear that Robespierre is increasingly, he has this idea of the general will, right? That the people have a will, a general will, and if everyone in the people has virtue, meaning everyone is thinking about what's good for the group, there should be absolute agreement. Right? Because the only reason you wouldn't agree is if you're thinking about yourself. And so, and Robespierre knows that he is really virtuous, and he knows he wants what's good for the revolution and what's good for France. And so he begins to think of himself as essentially the embodiment of the general will. What he wants is what France wants. And he has this, he imagines that the people of France are out there with the same sort of obsession about virtue that he has, and that they are all behind him. And so he really sees himself as sort of an avenging angel, if you will, cleansing the revolution and doing the will of the people of France. The more Robespierre is sort of organizing to go after this, the first group to realize that he's going after him is the enragés. Because Robespierre begins to criticize them more and more, and he's clearly still criticizing the terrorists. And so the terrorists realize that they really need to sort of fight back. And so on March 6th, the sans-culottes section, you remember that Paris is broken up into these sections, the section of Paris that the Cordelier Club was in, under the leadership of several of the terrorists, marches on City Hall. And they march on City Hall, and they try to take over, they try to march on the Hôtel de Ville. They're actually stopped. And at this point, the Hôtel de Ville is sort of aligned with the Jacobin Club. So Robespierre denounces it. In fact, even Collot d'Herbois, one of the terrorists, denounces the march on City Hall. But it's starting to come out in the open that the enragés realize they're threatened, and they realize that Robespierre and his faction, and still Danton and Desmoulins, are a threat to them. And so it's started to come out in the open. There's a real split here. And the split is both between, it's within the Cordelier Club, it's within the convention, and it's even within the Committee of Public Safety inside the convention. On March 13th, Robespierre and one of his closest associates, Saint-Just, Saint-Just is interesting. He's I mentioned him before, but he's only in his early 20s. He's like 23 or something like this. But he's a brilliant orator, and he's been a close associate of Robespierre's this whole time. So Saint-Just and Robespierre decide to do something about it, and they're both on the Committee of Public Safety. And so on March 13th, they have a whole series of people arrested. They have Vincent arrested, they have Ronsin arrested, they have Hébert arrested, and here's where it's really interesting. They could have just arrested them and accused them of putting them on killing too many people, because they were all involved in deaths. But Robespierre and Saint-Just knew that if they accused them of being too bloodthirsty as terrorists, they would be supported by the Sans-Culottes. And the Sans-Culottes might try to storm the convention or something like that. And so Robespierre and Saint-Just instead accuse Hébert, Ronsin, and Vincent of having tried to sabotage the food supply. This is the one thing the Sans-Culottes really care about. And the Sans-Culottes, more than anything else, want anybody executed who has anything to do with raising prices or sabotaging the food supply. So doing this was a way of splitting Hébert, Ronsin, and Vincent away from their supporters, the Sans-Culottes. They're put on trial, Hébert, Vincent, and Ronsin. There's actually 20 people, but those are the three big ones. Are arrested and they're put on trial on March 21st to the 24th, 1794, and then they are executed. Several days after that, Robespierre and the Committee pushes through the Committee of Public Safety to have a number of just plain old terrorists, people who had been representatives on mission with the revolutionary armies, has them arrested. And I believe it's at this point Fouché, I don't have it in my notes, but I believe it's at this point Fouché is arrested, and Chaumette, who was another terrorist, is arrested. And a number of members of the city government of Paris are purged by the Committee of Public Safety. They're arrested. And so it seems like Robespierre, in late March, by getting rid of Hébert, Ronsin, Vincent, sort of cutting off the heads of the leaders of the Sans-Culottes, taking control of the city hall again, it looks like he has essentially, arresting a bunch of terrorists, it looks like Robespierre has sort of stopped the terror, because the most bloodthirsty people have been arrested now and executed, and they've either been executed like Hébert, Ronsin, and Vincent, or they're in jail like Chaumette and Fouché, etc., waiting for trial and almost certainly to be executed. And so it looks like the terror might be over. But Robespierre is not done, because Robespierre really had decided that the revolution needed a massive cleansing. Not just a little bit around the edges, but a massive cleansing. And so Robespierre now decides that he has to actually take firm control of the process and make sure that it's entirely legal and virtuous and by the rules, by the book. But he wants to make sure that it cleanses everybody who is without virtue from the revolution. And so Robespierre then sets in motion a new process, a second stage of the terror that really begins in March here and goes through until July. And this stage of the terror is much more institutional. And essentially what Robespierre sees happening now is not mass executions with mitraillades and noyades, etc. That's way too chaotic. Instead, he wants each and every person to have a trial and to be tried according to revolutionary principles and to be held up to a standard of absolute virtue. And when that is done, he wants a cleansing. He wants all the guilty to be punished. And so Robespierre basically sets about using the Committee of Public Safety to create a legal system that's capable of cleansing the revolution. On February 5th, Robespierre actually gave a speech. This is before he'd taken down Hébert en Saint-Vincent. And I want to just read a little bit of this speech because it really captures the way he's using Rousseau. He said, what then is the fundamental principle of democratic or popular government? That is to say, the essential underpinning which sustains it and makes it work. It is virtue, which is nothing other than the love of the land of your birth and its laws. This sublime sentiment supposes a preference for the public interest above all particular interest. The first rule of your political conduct must be to relate all you do to maintaining equality and developing virtue. In the system of the French Revolution, what is immoral is impolitic. What corrupts is counter-revolutionary. Weakness, vices, and prejudices are the high road to monarchy. So, Robespierre, he actually falls ill in March. But when he comes out of being ill, he falls ill for a couple weeks. When he comes out of being ill, he decides to really go at it. So on March 19th, Fabre d'Églantine goes on trial. On March 30th, Danton and Desmoulins are arrested. And on March 31st, actually after Danton and Desmoulins are arrested, Saint-Just gets up in the convention and makes an impassioned speech saying that this is the final cleansing of France, that this is the last bit of the terror. But it's really not. And on April 2nd, rather, Danton, Desmoulins, Fabre d'Églantine, and the others are brought up on trial. And this is kind of interesting because they start to defend themselves in court, and Danton is such a freaking amazing orator that the crowd starts to side with him, and the judges start to fear that they're actually, the crowd is not only going to support Danton, but they might lynch the judges. And so the first day of the trial, Danton gives such an electric speech about freedom and liberty and et cetera, that the whole crowd is on his side, and the judges are terrified this is gonna go off the rails. And so on the second day of the trial, they claim that there's a revolt in the prisons, and they have to shut down the prisons, or lock down the prisons, and so Danton cannot be there for the second day of his trial. They then convict him pretty quickly, and on April 5th, Fabre d'Églantine, Danton, Desmoulins, and the others go to the guillotine. And one of the funny moments of this is Danton. He actually his face was scarred because he had been gored by a bull with a bullhorn and just gashed his face when he was a small kid. And so his face was kind of disfigured, but he was kind of a handsome guy anyway. And he, when he's mounting the scaffold to go have his head cut off, he says to the executioner, "Make sure you hold my head up and show it to the crowd because it's worth seeing." Right? So Danton is executed on April 5th. And then Robespierre then sets off to make his cleansing terror systematic. First thing he does is he passes through the Committee of Public Safety an argument that instead of having trials all over France, anybody who's accused of counter-revolutionary activity has to be brought to Paris and put on trial by Paris tribunals. And the reason for that is that Robespierre trusts the tribunals he can oversee, but he doesn't trust the tribunals elsewhere in France. So he wants to bring everybody to Paris to make sure that all the judgments are uniform and according to his idea of virtue. And then, when all these people have been arrested everywhere, get sent to Paris, he realizes he needs to. The Paris courts can't handle it. It's overloading the Paris courts. So he pushes through the law of 22 Prairial in April of 1794. The law of 22 Prairial has a number of provisions. One is that it dramatically increases the number of judges in Paris so that they can run more courts. But it does two other things which are really rather important. The first thing is it decrees that witnesses are no longer necessary for a trial. So basically, somebody can be accused of counter-revolutionary activity and be arrested, and the person making the accusation can submit evidence, but there are no witnesses necessary. So the person making the accusation is the only person submitting evidence. Then the judges are allowed to ask for more evidence, but they usually didn't. But defendants got no lawyers and no defense counsel, and they did not know what they were accused of or what the evidence against them was. And so essentially, any defense had to be made by a defendant, and they didn't know what they were being accused of or what the evidence was, so they had to just sort of stand up and in general argue that they were a good person. And under the new system, it was possible and in fact required for a person to be tried and punished within 24 hours of having been arrested. And the only sentences judges are allowed to hand down now are guilty with the penalty of death or innocent with release. Well, this speeds up the process considerably. And between March of 1793, which is this sort of one date people give for the beginning of the terror, and August of 1794, 2,639 people were guillotined in the Place de la Révolution in Paris. But of the 2,600, 1,500 were executed in June and July of 1794. So under Robespierre here, with this sped-up court system, the number of court cases increases dramatically, the number of convictions increases dramatically, and the number of executions increases dramatically. And in fact, some days they're having 200 or 300 people executed in the Place de la Révolution in Paris. You can go there today. It's actually today it's called the Place de Concorde. It's sort of the west end of the Louvre, and today it's got a carousel in there, and it's sort of an open plaza. But you can go there and see exactly where the guillotine was. Robespierre wasn't just interested in sort of a judicial cleansing. He wanted to set the revolution on the right course. And so he did a number of other things. And a lot of what he did went directly at the sans-culottes. And this is an important point because the Marxists argue that a big part of the terror was the bourgeoisie solidifying its control. And Robespierre is middle class. He is bourgeois. He's a lawyer. And the Jacobins, who are the sort of power base for Robespierre, are largely middle class because they have an entry fee, they have a membership fee, which is high enough that only middle class people could afford it. Poor people can't, which is why they tend to congregate at the Cordelier Club. And so Robespierre, he pushes through the convention a cap on wages. He caps wages. Wages have a maximum, which really benefits employers but does not benefit workers. So he's really going right at the sans-culottes here. He also passes a law that doesn't allow for unions to form. So, and this, during the revolution, you saw the first stories of sort of labor unions forming, demanding higher wages. And Robespierre is like, no, we're not doing that. And ultimately, the justification here was that they were doing it in terms of fair trade, that labor unions impeded fair trade, and et cetera. And so, but the net result is that Robespierre is passing a number of laws that are going directly against the interests of the sans-culottes and directly in the interests of middle-class business owners, et cetera. And then finally, what Robespierre does is he decides that the de-Christianization movement had gone too far. And Robespierre had actually argued during the de-Christianization movement that you need a religion. People need to believe in God in order to be virtuous and to live morally, because they have to fear punishment. And so, but Robespierre did not want to bring back the Catholic Church. He was very much a revolutionary. He very much didn't like the Catholic Church, and he thought the Catholic Church was horribly conservative. And so Robespierre decides to bring back, to start a new religion called the Cult of the Supreme Being. And so on May 7th at the convention, he proposes the Cult of the Supreme Being. And then on June 8th, they have a ceremony to launch the Cult of the Supreme Being. They have a parade through Paris, and they hire an actress to play, actually, I'm sorry, that was the Cult of Reason. So they have a parade through Paris, and it goes to Notre Dame again, and they consecrate Notre Dame as the temple of the supreme being. And so they're implying it's a sort of a deist argument that there is a God, but we don't know much about him, and he doesn't have a specific religion, so we're just going to sort of worship this nameless God, the supreme being. A lot of people felt Robespierre took part in the procession. He actually walked in the procession. And a lot of people thought, I mean, by this point, people were feeling like Robespierre had too much power. He was becoming a dictator because he dominated the Committee of Public Safety. He had all of his, who seemed like all of his rivals executed. He was starting a new religion. Here he's marching at the beginning of it, so it looks like he might be positioning himself to be some sort of religious leader. And a lot of people realized that a lot of people were really getting nervous that Robespierre was making himself a dictator, a tyrant, a king. And so, and there were still people like Collot d'Herbois and Carrier who were not arrested, but were really worried about it, right? And so you started to see a bunch of opposition to Robespierre forming. And it formed from all the places you'd expect. All the former terrorists who were still around, were not in prison, were getting worried about their heads, right? What if Robespierre comes for me next? All the former associates of Danton who hadn't been arrested, they're worried about their heads, right? What if somebody accuses me of corruption because I knew Danton? And then there were, and in general, just everybody, nobody knew who was going to get accused of being counter-revolutionary, and you get accused, you get arrested, you get tried, and you get executed all in like one day. It happens so fast. Everyone is sort of terrified. Well, the opposition starts tentatively. On June 9th, they push through, the convention pushes through a law which says that deputies in the convention cannot be arrested and put on trial. And so they're basically saying, you can't touch us, Robespierre, right? But that's really, they realize that, you know, this is not really as good a bulwark, it's not foolproof, that Robespierre could probably still have them arrested and push it through. And Robespierre began to sense this. He began to feel that, oh yeah, I can sense that people are starting to turn against me here. I'm feeling opposition. And Robespierre really began to get sort of paranoid. He probably was clinically paranoid at this point. That he was sure there were people out to get him. He was sure there were conspiracies everywhere behind his back. He was sure that all the evil people that he was trying to root out were going to unite against him. And so he increasingly starts to show up at the convention and just demand, you know, action against the people. He's never quite sure who's the enemy, but he wants action against the enemy. On June 12th, he shows up at the convention, he gives a speech, and he demands he says there's a conspiracy. He doesn't name anybody, but says there's a conspiracy, and he demands 9 heads from the convention. He says it's a conspiracy in the convention, and he demands that 9 people be executed. Right? Nobody knows who he's talking about. Everyone's like, oh my gosh, what do you think is me? And the convention voted that down. They did not allow him to take 9 deputies from the convention. They said no. So Robespierre takes that as, oh, the conspiracy is bigger than I thought. And Robespierre he almost stops coming to the convention. He only made a few more appearances at the convention. He generally gave nightly speeches at the Jacobin Club laying out what he thought should be happening, but he stopped going to the convention because he thought the convention was full of conspirators. So after a long time of not going to the convention, he shows up again on July 23rd. And he shows up and he denounces Collot d'Herbois and Biot and several others by name and says they are part of a conspiracy. These guys are former terrorists, okay? But he doesn't actually do anything about it. He simply says they're in a conspiracy and they're terrorists, and then he leaves. Well, he's basically just sort of threatened them without doing anything to stop them from fighting back. And so you start to see an actual conspiracy start to form against Robespierre. I mean, certainly Collot d'Herbois and Biot are like, I got nothing to lose here. He's coming for me, so I'd better start organizing people to stop Robespierre. So they start going around to everybody they know in the convention saying, hey, Robespierre is insane. He's becoming a tyrant. He's becoming a dictator. We've got to stop him. And then on July 26th, Robespierre shows up at the convention, and he gives a long, rambling speech that just seems to go in every direction at once. And he doesn't name anyone, but he basically accuses the entire convention of conspiring against him. He basically says, you're all conspirators in some grand scheme to overthrow the revolution. And he calls for all the traitors to be crushed. And he says it even extends into the Committee of Public Safety, which has only 9 members, one of whom is Robespierre. And he says it's even the Committee of Public Safety has conspirators and traitors in it. And so he basically had declared war on the convention. Everybody in the convention says, oh, he just accused me of treason. This is a guy who's having 750 people a month executed in the Place de la Révolution. I don't know if I can trust my life to him just not picking me. So the Collot d'Herbois and Billaud, of course, are the real organizers behind the anti-Robespierre conspiracy. So they decide the next day is July 27th. And every day in the convention, the rule is that one of the members of the convention is the president of the convention that day. And this person functions sort of like the Speaker of the House does in the U.S. House of Representatives, in that the president of the convention decides who gets to speak and what order people can speak, and then the president of the convention decides if they're going to vote on anything. Right? So it's a position of serious power, and they rotated it through the whole convention. So every day, another deputy would be the president of the convention, so that nobody would have too much power. Well, it just so happened that the next day, July 27th, which was 9 Thermidor under the revolutionary calendar, Collot d'Herbois was going to be the president of the convention. And so they decided, he and Billaud and others decided they were gonna carry out a plan. They were gonna bring down Robespierre. And so the next day, what they did, Robespierre actually showed up again, and he was apparently expecting there would be a vote to sort of take out people that Robespierre thought should be taken out. But instead, Collot d'Herbois calls on, he had set it up that he was going to call a set of speakers all in a row, and each one of them had a point to make about Robespierre and would denounce Robespierre. And so one guy gets up and denounces Robespierre, and then Collot d'Herbois picks another guy who gets up and denounces Robespierre. And then he picks another guy who denounces Robespierre. And then, a bunch of Robespierre's allies try to jump up and say, I want to speak. But Collot d'Herbois is like, no, you don't get to speak. I'm only taking him, and he's going to denounce Robespierre. And I'm going to pick him, and he's going to denounce Robespierre. And then Robespierre himself stood up and said, I demand to speak. And the whole crowd, the whole convention started to shout, down with the tyrant, down with the tyrant. Well, Robespierre and Saint-Just and Couthon and other of Robespierre's associates, they take off out of the convention. And they're like really shaken by this. Like, oh my gosh, the whole convention was shouting down to the tyrant. So Robespierre was already as a conspiracy, so he decides there really is a conspiracy because he had sort of made one happen. And so that night, Robespierre and Saint-Just and others are trying to sort of rally all their forces, and they think the National Guard is on their side. They know the sans-culottes are not on their side, but they think the National Guard is on their side, and they think there's a lot of deputies in the convention who are still on their side. So they try to rally the population. Well, the convention actually passes an act saying that Saint-Just and Robespierre should be arrested. Right? And others that are Robespierre's associates. So now it's out in the open. The convention wants to arrest Robespierre and his associates. Robespierre and his friends retreat to City Hall, and they set up a base of operations there, and they try to call in the National Guard to come and defend City Hall, and then they're going to use the National Guard to march on the convention and have all the members of the convention arrested. But the convention, for its part, claims that, passes an act saying that Robespierre and Saint-Just had escaped from prison. Well, what had actually happened was that Robespierre and Saint-Just had decreed, in their power as Committee of Public Safety, they had decreed all the prisons closed, which means no one could be put in prison. Well, so they couldn't be arrested, basically. Well, then the convention, in return, votes, this is all in the middle of the night, by the way, votes that Robespierre and Saint-Just have essentially escaped from prison. What they've done is equivalent to escaping from prison. And under the law that Saint-Just himself had pushed through the convention, anybody who escapes from prison can be shot on sight. Well, basically, at 2 in the morning, the National Guard refuses to show up. Henriot, who is one of Robespierre's friends, is there at the city hall, but the National Guard just doesn't show up. Some do, but most don't. And so when the sans-culottes start to, and in fact, some of the other members of the convention rally members of the National Guard, and they get some sans-culottes too, to join them, and they basically march to City Hall, where Robespierre and Saint-Just and all his friends are still there, and they surround City Hall, and then they break in and they arrest Robespierre and Saint-Just and Couthon and Henriot and all of Robespierre's close associates. Robespierre himself, as they're storming City Hall, he tries to kill himself. He takes a pistol and tries to shoot himself, but instead of hitting him in the head, he ends up just blowing off half of his jaw. But they grab Robespierre and Saint-Just and all the rest, and they march them off, and the next day, which is actually the 28th, they put them on trial, and they convict them under the law of 22 Prairial, and they take them to the Place de la Révolution, and they execute them. And then over the course, and then the next day, the 29th, they go and arrest everybody else who's associated with Robespierre, and they put them all on trial, and they take them to the Place de la Révolution and arrest and execute them. And Robespierre's last words are actually an inarticulate scream, because he had so many bandages on his head that his head wouldn't fit into the guillotine, and so the executioners simply ripped the bandages off his head, and Robespierre gives this inarticulate scream of agony, and then gets shoved into the guillotine and has his head cut off. So about 80 people are executed the 28th and 29th of July, which is actually the 10th and 11th of the month of Thermidor under the revolutionary calendar. And so the fall of Robespierre, it really is the beginning of the end of the terror. There are some more executions in August as the people associated with different groups get rounded up and executed. But basically by August, the terror is over. And we'll talk about it next time, but the period that begins then is called Thermidor, because it started in the month of Thermidor, the hot month, July. And so it's as if, and Crane Brinton calls this when the fever breaks, right? And so just as a sort of a reminder about all this, that when you're looking at the terror, I want you to think about how each side sees it. The Marxists argue that the terror was essentially class warfare. And so you want to see, for the Marxists, they want to see who's killing whom. And if you believe the Marxists, you're going to look for the bourgeoisie executing aristocrats. That was there in 1793, right? Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette, a bunch of aristocrats get executed in 1793. And then a portion of that terror against the Vendée and the Chouans is clearly against the monarchists and their supporters. So you could argue that's class warfare. But the Federalist Revolt is very much middle class versus middle class. The people who are getting executed in the Federalist Revolt were often early supporters of the revolution who thought the revolution had gone off track. And if you look at this part of the terror that Robespierre carried out, there aren't any, well, there's very few aristocrats being executed. There are some. But mostly what you're getting is revolutionaries killing each other. These are middle-class revolutionaries killing each other. Now, the one exception to that is that it's pretty clear that Robespierre was carrying out a sort of a series of attacks on the sans-culottes, who are lower class. And so the Marxist position is that this part of the terror was basically the middle class pushing down the lower class to get them out of the revolutionary process. The first part of the terror was taking out the aristocrats. The second part of the terror is taking out the sans-culottes. But you do have to explain why, and the Marxists don't have a good explanation for this, why so many other people who were middle class wound up dying in the terror. Right? Now, Furet argues that the terror was all about Rousseau. They argue that Robespierre is the key player here. This idea of Republican virtue, the idea of the general will, was an absolute thing. That the general will was seen as being single, monolithic, unified, and it was absolute. And basically, in Furet's reading, everybody thought that the general will was like that, and so everybody thought they represented the general will. And so the terrorists are happy to kill lots of people in the name of the general will, and Robespierre is happy to kill the terrorists in the name of the general will, etc. And so for Furet, the terror is not about class warfare. It's actually about people. It's about this power vacuum that nobody can decide who's actually right, and there's no process for resolving disputes or anything. Everyone simply claims that they have the absolute right, represented the general will, to do what they want, and they wind up just killing each other because they can't agree. So that's Furet's position. And we'll see Baker adds some twists onto that in a little bit when we read Baker. But then, of course, Tackett and Andrus argue that essentially this is about personalities. These people are all doing different things. They're all sort of jockeying for power. They're making decisions. And the terror is simply the product of the result of all those different people making all those different decisions all at the same time. So you can think about that. You can think about what does it all mean, and does theory adequately explain the terror? But for now, we're going to turn next time to Thermidor.